All right, good morning again. Before we get into the panel again, just to cover for those of the folks that weren't here for the panels yesterday, just a little bit of an admin note. All of you should have notepads and pens at your places when we get through the introductions and get to the Q&A session or section of the panel. If you have a question, please just write that on your notepad. Hold up the question, make eye contact with me or one of the other runners. We'll come over, we'll grab your question, they'll funnel the questions to me, and then I'll hand them to our panel host so he can parse those out and address them to the panelists that you desired. So without any further ado, I would like to call to the stage Cadet First Class Kishan Patel to introduce our first panel host for the morning.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Cadet First Class Kishan Patel, and it is my pleasure to introduce to you Lieutenant General Retired Henry Raduege. General Raduege served 35 years in the Armed Forces, retiring in 2005 as the Director of the Defense Information System Agency and the Commander of Joint Task Force Global Network Operations. Shortly thereafter, he joined the Cohen Group, where he now serves as a Senior Counselor. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Lieutenant General Retired Harry Raduege.
Well, I want to say a big thank you to Cadet First Class Kishan Patel for that nice introduction. Kishan is in his senior year at the Air Force Academy, and he is majoring in computer science. And he wants to work in the cyber arena, and of course, he's got his eye also on this new U.S. Space Force. Anything else that is related to that type environment in our future. I want to give compliments, as always, to our AFCEA Rocky Mountain chapter. They work hard all year long to pull off these magnificent events. I know because they pull me in around June to start talking about what the program's going to be. But truly, it's a labor of love of these folks from AFCEA, and always will be, for General Shea with International and our Rocky Mountain chapter executives. These symposiums are just so critical, especially during this dynamic, changing time in our environment today. And our panel this year is going to be addressing industry perspectives on Cyber 2030. Sometimes when I see that 2030, it seems like a really big number. My gosh, that's 10 years. And so it's coming quickly. And so the way we're going to conduct this panel is the way I've had the privilege of conducting these in the past, because it seemed to work fairly well. But I'll begin with a few of my own opening comments. I'm going to then introduce each panel member individually, and then each of these panel members is going to give us between 5 to 6 minutes of introductory thoughts. And this is the kind of tee up some questions that you might have or comments that you might have when we go into the audience Q&A session. And I want to remind everybody that our Q&A session will be both written and microphone questions. For those of you who aren't shy, you can use the microphone. For those who want to send embarrassing questions to the podium, you can write those down and not sign your name. So please take advantage of these tremendously talented and experienced panel experts that we have with us today. I would say that we're living in a time of unprecedented change. And we've said that over the years, but I don't think there's any time that has been more unprecedented than we are living in now. And today, and over the next 10 years, I think that the perfect storm seems to be building around the intersection of numerous technologies, such as the Internet of Things, artificial intelligence, 5G, robotic process automation, cloud, blockchain, astrophysics, cybersecurity, augmented reality, machine learning, low Earth orbit internet, quantum computing, and autonomous security. It's quite a list, and they're all here or coming or evolving. For folks like those that are assembled here today, that's you, that's a lot to consider and work with. And with all the complexity facing us daily, I often ask myself, how will we be able to best design, acquire, train, and utilize these areas of technology advancements in bettering the world around us? And of course, for some, like me, and others on this panel who have spent decades focused on national-level defense and security considerations, we're primarily interested in preserving and enhancing national security. Notably, as we've also heard, the President's National Security Telecommunications Advisory Council, also known as the NSTAC, published their report calling for a cybersecurity moonshot, adding afterwards that 2019, last year, needed to be the year of action for this 10-year effort. And notably, from General Chad Raduege's panel, by the way, that really sounds good to me. From his panel yesterday, Colonel Dave Caswell recognized that, quote, we're swimming in data already. And Colonel Lauren Corshane noted that, quote, the ops tempo is only going to get bigger. And I totally agree with them. So with all the considerations of growing speeds, capabilities, and mobility, we must ask ourselves, will our newest creations and evolutions in cyber relative technologies positively nurture or negatively disrupt our lives? For many, those are the major considerations in cyber advancements over the next 10 years. So today we're fortunate to have 4 very busy cyberspace experts who are here to give us their perspectives on where cyber is heading over the next 10 years. And after their brief comments, they also will graciously answer your questions concerning Cyber 2030. Let me start now by individually introducing each member, and they will provide 5 to 6 comments to kind of put in perspective what's on their minds, and hopefully that's going to intersect with what's on your minds. Our first speaker today is Chris Smith. His government service consists of having been a U.S. military veteran in Joint Tactical Communications. And Chris served in the JCSE at MacDill Air Force Base, Joint Communications Support Element. He led multiple missions for the Air Force and the Air National Guard. He's a former CIO of the U.S. Department of Agriculture, and he led one of the largest government transitions to cloud computing. He's had senior positions at General Services Administration, GSA, and the Internal Revenue Service, IRS, which are probably on our minds right about this time of the year. In industry, he was the Chief Technology and Innovation Officer at Accenture, and currently he's at AT&T, Global Public Sector, where he leads technology, strategy, and operations in cybersecurity, the Internet of Things, cloud, mobility, and unified communications. Ladies and gentlemen, Chris Smith.
Thank you, General Raduege. Thank you all. Well, if you weren't awake when you got out of bed this morning, you certainly were if you walked across the grounds here to get here, right? That'll wake you up. Amazingly, it was 70 degrees in D.C. when I left I think it was yesterday morning. Went to Monterey, had a great visit with the Naval Postgraduate School, but it was like 30 there. So it actually feels just about right here in Colorado Springs for early February. You know, it's 2020, which is interesting, right? It's one of those kind of decade points you look and wonder where you were going to be in 2020. Well, we're all sitting here today, but I thought I'd actually go a little bit down memory lane since we're talking about cybersecurity. As a young captain, I was in Bala-Catano 1, which was a joint coalition combined exercise. We still carry on the Bala-Catans today, but at that point in the Philippines, we had lost an aircraft from the Navy onto Hainan Island that time, if you recollect the history, in '01 in that spring and summer. But why it was important to me, and as you guys look at your careers, it was the first time I was hacked by a foreign adversary. At the time, we thought it was a hacktivist outfit. That term wasn't really even in vogue at that point, but it was actually the beginning of the APT threat that we've been up against now for 20 years. But we had our Nipper kind of MWR site that we had hacked while we were out actually doing some MWR activities with the Filipinos there playing a basketball game. And yes, they did stomp us into the dirt. Filipinos are very good basketball players, and we were not the best. But that was the beginning of my experience in the cybersecurity world, and it was a rude awakening. Fast forward about 2 years after 9/11, had other postings around, but ended up back in the Philippines as the J6 for the Joint Special Operations Task Force in the Philippines. And at that point in the calendar, the I love you worm had just started to move around the world. For any of you keeping track of the history here, that was the biggest and may still be the biggest worm outbreak that we've had over history. But as the 6th, I sat there, and as we brought joint forces into the fight and they brought their assets into the theater, everybody was a different place in their cybersecurity hygiene. And this was still very early when you get to the point that I'm going to get to here in 2020. But I've also had the privilege of going from there onto multiple missions and then leading a civilian agency. I had to lead a cabinet level agency. We had about 7,000 locations in the United States, 100 countries overseas, very large operations, and really were being attacked and data infiltrated from some of the most advanced, again, we term APTs today, but nation states. The hacktivists, Anonymous at the time, was very active, and just criminal activity with keystroke loggers coming into. Long story short, I had the pleasure of leading a cabinet level agency from 0 to 120 miles an hour in the cybersecurity arena. Fast forward a little bit more, and to today, and you look at these fragmented kind of point-in-time things that occurred. We're 20 years into the cybersecurity long war, if you will, and the advancement of the technology continues at a pace that I don't even think we're going to be able to forecast at certain points along the path. One of those that we didn't forecast real well was the advent of the smartphone and how that was going to move compute to the edge and how do you secure that. So really there's been this proliferation across the waterfront, if you will, on the attack surface, the number of devices that are out there over that 20-year period. And today, the amount of information we're moving is staggering. Just a few short years ago, we were doing somewhere in the exabyte a year range. This year, we'll cross 12 exabyte a month just in wireless communications, right? And that's 1,000 petabytes in an exabyte, so staggering numbers that are out there. That will probably grow by 400,000% over the next couple of years. We've seen that in our internal networks. To make that real to you, to the amount of information we're moving around the globe and across that kind of little historical context I just gave you, think about the number of people that are on the planet, roughly 7.8 billion. There are more devices today than there are people connected. We expect that to be about 1.5 devices in the near future, so there'll be around 12 to 15 billion devices that are going to be out there. And that proliferation of information, expand it to IoT and what's going to occur with 5G. We're in the somewhere around 10 billion devices out there connected today, depending on whose study you look at. The growth in that area is somewhere 50 billion. You can pick the numbers, you can look at where this is going. But the question is, how do we stay in front on that path that we've taken? Are we being successful? Knowing what's coming at us, probably not with a crystal ball, but the proliferation is going to continue. The attack surface is going to continue to grow. I think the question is, are we organized and ready to execute. Yes, we are out there every day, each one of you. I would say industry, academia, not-for-profits, industry is out there fighting. We've got great examples of where people do it very well, but collectively, I don't think we're doing it as well as we can. So I'm going to put 4 things out there, and then I'm going to stop my remarks, and that is virtualization. I didn't hit upon it, but when I took the cabinet-level civilian agency from 0 to 120, we went out and found these 7 best capabilities that were out there. We racked and stacked them, put it into a fusion center, and really changed the dynamic. We did other things like Hygiene 101, but really it was taking the best capabilities out there and getting them out as quickly as we could and putting them in line. Well, that was in 2008, ladies and gentlemen. And yes, we've done that with JRSS, but virtualization is the word I want you to think about. We can't do that again. We don't have the physics, really, to do it. When you think about the number of pieces of hardware that have to be racked and stacked in line against the exponential growth in the information that I talked about, we cannot do it with proprietary hardware racked and stacked over time. We've got to go to virtualization and making sure that we can change those great capabilities on the fly when we need to and be resilient, be out in front of the adversary, and continue to change as we go along. Second, you touched on this, General. Automation, machine learning is here, it's real, it's mainstream. Yes, AI is here, and it's real. I would say it's not exactly mainstream yet. A lot of good things going on there, but let's take advantage of the automation and what we can do with machine learning, which we've gotten very, very good at. AI is there and it's coming, but let's take the things that we have. Next, I would just say Advanced Identity and Access Management, or ICAM if you want to go with that acronym. The term Zero Trust is thrown around a lot, but the reality is we've got to be very specific, very mature in how we allow access, and access at the right time to the right information. And I think we've got some ways to go there, but that needs to be in your vernacular. If it's not, I'm sure it is. But again, it's not the hyperbole of what's out ahead of us. It's the question of what we have today, knowing how we're going to change it and how we're going to change the dynamic and use it today to protect ourselves and to win the fight against the adversary. And lastly, I'm just going to say it, everybody will say it, but it's people. You cannot throw people at this, but we still have to have the best and the brightest using those things I talked about just now. But we've got to have people that understand, that are innovative, that are willing to take risk, that are going to be in there in the fight. But it's not about huge armies of people. It's about very specific sets of individuals out there in the fight. So I'm glad to be here with all of you. And that's my remarks at this point.
Great.
General.
Thank you very much, Chris. The next speaker, really, in this audience, and many other places, needs really no introduction. But what I need to explain is that Major General retired Suzanne Zan Vautrinot didn't know she was going to be on this panel until last night when I asked her, because we had an individual who was forecast and advertised who was going to be with us who had a family emergency come up and had to cancel. And I thought, I want somebody else that's going to talk kind of the technology piece, like Chris did with his time and experience, and now with AT&T. But I asked Zan last night if she would do this. And being Zan, she never refuses to do those kinds of things. A little bit about her background, some of you may have forgotten, but she's one of the earliest female graduates of the United States Air Force Academy. And so for over 30 years, she served in space and cyber operations positions. In her last duty assignment, of course, she was the 24th Air Force Commander, where she led a workforce of 14,000 military, civilian, and contractor personnel in conducting both offensive and defensive cyber ops for the Department of Defense. And currently, Zan is staying very busy. She's the president of Kilovolt Consulting Incorporated, and Zan serves on the boards of director for numerous organizations, including Wells Fargo, Ecolab, Parsons, Battelle Memorial Institute, and most recently, that I just found out last night, she's on the board of CSX Transportation, which is the leading supplier of rail-based freight transportation in North America. And her husband, Bill, says, Zan's now working with choo-choo trains. So that's the way Bill put it. In December, the last day of December, actually, Zan came off of the board of directors of Symantec, where she served honorably and most effectively for quite some time. So Zan has won prestigious awards, but I just have to mention one of them. She was inducted into the National Academy of Engineering in 2017. So ladies and gentlemen, general vote to no.
Thank you, sir. And it really is Zan. I love that when you retire, you get your first name back. There are so many stories that I've lived with many people in the audience, so I'm not going to go backwards. What I'm going to tell you is what I've been watching happen over the last 6 years, and I think is going to ramp up and happen even more rapidly. And that is that corporations are connecting the dots. They're already doing it. And what I mean by that is that they have already made the decision that they need to be different in the future in terms of their baseline core competencies than they have been in the past. And they're not doing this because they're good guys and they love technology and all that kind of stuff. This is beyond competitive advantage. This is really existential. Will they exist and be able to be relevant in the future is determined by what kinds of competencies they demonstrate and therefore what they provide to their customers, to the consumers. So let me give you a couple of examples. Harry mentioned Symantec. You'll note that Symantec doesn't exist anymore. All of the enterprise assets for Symantec were sold very successfully to Broadcom. Broadcom did not buy those assets in order to be a cybersecurity company. Broadcom bought that technology and that understanding, that core competency that was inherent in the enterprise development in order to complete their circle so that they go all the way from development of product and capability, and the way that they provide it is in a secure fashion. So it's more than just providing the elements and having different companies that do that. These companies are becoming singular entities that provide digital and communication capabilities, the underpinning of all other things, in a way that is holistic. And they're not the only ones. You know, certainly when you look at any number of other companies, Verizon, for example, you probably know that they brought Yahoo, and that's, you know, interesting, but not compelling. They also bought Straight Path, they bought Votel and several other companies, 22 now in just the last few years, 22 different companies, not because they wanted to be bigger, but because they wanted to complete that loop of digital capability, analytics, delivery of systems across a number of different facets. So when you talk about a service provider, so we say internet service provider in the United States, globally, service providers are those that are providing not just communications, the internet of the old days, but all of the capabilities and applications and analytics and digitization that goes behind that foundationally to the customer, and that's happening globally. The same thing is happening in companies that leverage what we would think of as internet or cyber companies. So I serve on the board of Ecolab, and Ecolab is a sanitization, think of them as a chemical company. But those chemicals are put through every possible industrial process. So anything that's happening in a big factory, including making paper, anything that's happening in a hotel, all of the cleaning processes and warewashing and everything about how soft your towels are and how clean they are, all of those processes in dairies. As everything comes from the cow to your table, everything comes through all of those systems, and there are chemicals that go through that have to make them pristine. So think of it as pristine manufacturing through chemicals. All of their R&D was chemical engineering. 2,500 PhD chemists in the background. Now they have 1,000 of the same level of folks that are cyber, that are digital, that are AI. And that's because all of those processes, they now have the ability at a molecular level to collect all the data, and instead of doing it by how much time and how much heat, they do it by when is the system actually pristine. And the data tells them that, and the algorithms tell them that. But they didn't try to build that internally. They partnered with Microsoft, and they used the underpinning of Microsoft from their on-premise so that they still own the algorithms. That is their core competency. It's also their intellectual property. And they apply this. So what I'm telling you is that this is not about just getting bigger. It's about getting better from a standpoint of what we call cyber, that means so many different things, as Harry pointed out, and I won't go through that list again. But they are thinking about it differently, and they're thinking about it because they want to continue to exist. And frankly, the government demands that they exist in that new fashion. You look at a company like Wells Fargo, everyone that they do business with, every cloud provider, every app provider, they are responsible for whether that works. The folks that do the regulation, the regulators for a great big financial institution, hold that financial institution responsible for anything that goes wrong in their resiliency and their business continuity, even if it was entirely about a third party or a provider. That is what it means to be existential in the way that you think about this, and I'll leave it there.
Great. Thank you very much, Zan. I think you can understand why I was absolutely thrilled less than 12 hours ago when I asked Zan if she would agree to serve and take the empty chair.
And I was drinking at the time.
For the record.
For the record. For the record.
But I think you can understand why I was thrilled that Zan was going to join us today. Our next panel member is the Honorable Sue Payton, and she's a renowned expert in acquisition, procurement, research and development, and technology transition. We've talked already, we've had a couple panel members that have talked about the technology aspects, and now Sue Payton is going to, I think, get into her ideas about where we're going in those areas that she's such an expert in. Her early career was in senior leadership in small businesses, and she also was with Martin Marietta and later Lockheed Martin. Her government service, very impressive. She's a former presidential appointee in 2 different administrations. She serves as the Assistant Secretary of the Air Force for Acquisition and the Deputy Undersecretary of Defense for Advanced Systems and Concepts. In those positions, she directed annual budgets that were over $30 billion in the areas of air, space, cyber, ISR, rapid global mobility, global strike, and command and control systems. And currently, Sue is the president of SCI Aerospace, where she advises small and large businesses and R&D labs on streamlined acquisition authorities, risk management, and growth strategies. Sue, the stage is yours.
Harry, thank you. Thank you. It's great to be here, and it's great to be on this panel. Zan and I go back a while, and this may be the first panel we've been on together. Chris, I appreciate your comments on the technology. Sue Campbell, I've got to tell you, for 21 years, my maiden name was Sue Campbell. So to be on a panel with Sue finally is really going to be exciting. I look forward to the questions that you might have as well. I really want to talk about, on a holistic level, 4 things. The first question I have for you, raise your hand if you have had a top secret briefing on the cyber threats to our nation. I would assume every hand in the audience should go up. Raise your hand if you've had a SAP briefing, Special Access Program briefing, on the threats to our nation. So one of the things I want to talk about today is how incredibly difficult it is to engage the American people and to help Congress get the resources they need when we overclassify the threats to our nation. I did not hear anywhere in the State of the Union any discussion of the threats that we have in cyber or the threats that we have to our space assets. Nowhere in the media do we see dedicated discussions about the threats we're facing. And without an all-hands-on-deck support of our funding profiles in Congress and getting congressmen and senators to get behind what we need to fund to solve some of our cyber issues, I think we're a long way away from actually being successful. I look at the National Cybersecurity Strategy that was published in September of 2018. It's a fantastic, well-written, terrific strategy. It covers 4 pillars. It covers almost a dozen goals, but you could define it as a hallucination. And the reason I say that is that my first association with linking strategy and planning to funding was when I was in OSD, and I realized I had 45 programs for the ACTD program, and the funding was just atrocious. It was spread across so many things because we had program managers' mouths to feed, right? We had industry's mouths to feed. We could get no traction. And we had so many programs that had no funding at all. I mean, the definition of a hallucination is a sensation that appears to be real, but created within the mind, seeing things that are not there, okay? So the overall government, federal government budget for FY20, unclassified, after this brilliant document came out, was $17.4 billion to fund 24 agencies. Most of those agencies have a half dozen or a dozen departments and bureaus. And the money gets spread so thin that there's no traction. The rose was pinned on the Department of Homeland Security to be responsible for the federal cybersecurity protection of everything except some national systems, the intelligence community, and the DoD. And they got $1.7 billion to do that in the unclassified budget. So we definitely need a way to get the threats into the hands of the American people so they realize there may not be any new money, but we had a $21.8 billion budget for global strike in one service, and $6.2 billion is for the F-35 for 1 year. And we need to take a look at realigning and rethinking how we are really funding the countering of the threats to our nation. So I want to talk about the threats, the hallucination, and the fragmentation. The other thing that I'm most worried about is trust. I have seen over the decade in which I've left the Pentagon an immense lack of trust between our industry, whether traditional or non-traditional defense contractors, and our government. And somehow we need to bridge the gap and start regaining trust in the very people that we need in government to help solve what's in our national cyber strategy. And the last thing I want to talk about is I have an immense amount of optimism and hope because there are some really good things going on in acquisition. You know, this was my binky. This was my Federal Acquisition Regulation book in 2007. God, what a threat to national security. Okay? This is twice, if you print it out, it's twice as large. And if I sit on it, man, I am really, that's really what it's really good for. There are lots of good things in this FAR, but we need lawyers and we need contracting officers and program managers who know how to apply the things in the FAR that will help us move quickly. We've got to reorganize how we do business. You cannot fragment requirements in one fiefdom, funding in another fiefdom, and program management in yet another fiefdom. You put the onus on the program manager, who has no control over the requirements and how quickly they get generated, and no control over the level of funding. More times than not, as the SAE of the Air Force, I just said no, because the money wasn't there and you can't start programs that are not healthy. So with that, I'm so excited to be here and I really look forward to your questions.
Thank you very much, Sue. Great comments. Our last panel member today, for some of you, probably needs no introduction either, Lieutenant General John Campbell. Now, he's a F-15 pilot, and back in the day, of course, fighter pilots didn't pick their own call sign. You didn't get to be Viper or, you know, something, Iceman. His buddies that flew with him, after observing him, they felt the most appropriate call sign for John Campbell was Soup. So he's been Soup for a long, long time. And when he retired, I've continued to work with Soup in outside activities. And he has tried to say, "My name is John Campbell." And then we're in the meetings, and somebody will say Soup, and somebody will say, "Who is that?" And they say, "That's John Campbell." So he will never be able to get rid of Soup Campbell. Okay. So F-15 pilot assignments to, I'm going to name a couple of these because I think they'll remind you of some areas: Keflavik, Iceland; Bitburg, Germany; Aviano, Italy; and Tyndall, Florida. He had post-flying assignments in the J-39. He was the J-39 in the Joint Staff. He was Vice Director of DISA, and he was the first commander of the Joint Task Force for Computer Network Defense. That's what started it all, ladies and gentlemen, now led to U.S. Cyber Command. And after departing DISA and the JTF for Computer Network Defense, Soup went on to the Central Intelligence Agency and served there. Following his military retirement, he worked at Applied Research Associates and then became the Executive Vice President of Iridium Satellite. And currently, he's the chairman of the Iridium Communications Government Advisory Board. And I'll tell you, General Campbell and the whole Iridium group are very happy, and we are very happy as a nation and a world because of the successful recent replenishment and replacement of all the Iridium satellites. And I'm proud to say that the United States Air Force signed a 7-year firm fixed price contract for Iridium satellite. He's the he's been the advisor to the president of the University of Maryland, now called Global College. There he worked for the last 10 years or so on cybersecurity degree programs that are taught both in the classroom and online globally. 2 different bachelor's degrees in cyber and 3 different master's degrees. And Soup was also the Iridium representative on the President's National Security Telecommunications Advisory Committee that produced the Cybersecurity Moonshot Report. And General Campbell may mention something about that. Now, he's a warrior, and I wanted to tell a quick war story. And Chris actually reminded me of this, and it goes back to that I love you virus. And I remember that very well because I was assigned out here as the J6 for NORAD, U.S. Space Command, and Air Force Space Command. And we happened to be out at a missile competition out in California. It was an annual competition. And I went out for a run early in the morning, and the comm squadron commander noticed I was out jogging, and he said, "Sir, he stopped his car, and he says, I'm on the way to the NOSC because there's this new virus that has started, and it's working its way across the world, and it's going to hit the United States. It started over in Europe, and we were watching it as it marched its way when people would turn on their computers at 8 o'clock in the morning. Mm-hmm. And so he said, I'm going to the NOSC. Do you want to know more about it? And I thought, yeah, I want to know more about it because we had just stood up and as U.S. Space Command were responsible for the organization that stood up the Joint Task Force for Computer Network Defense. So I'm in my jogging clothes. I go over to the NOSC and I'm looking at this thing, and I called General Campbell because he was sitting in the DISA NOSC as the JTF commander for Computer Network Defense. And I said, Soup, do you know about this? He says, yeah. He says, we're watching this. And I said, have you told General Eberhardt yet? He was our 4-star. And he says, are you going to tell him, or am I going to tell him, or is the U.S. Space Command J3 going to tell him? That's when we were at the early stages. And thank God, Soup Campbell said, I'll tell him. I mean, we were at that point. In the early development of this to tell the 4-star who was really in charge of that. So General Campbell gathered as much information as he could that we knew about the I love you. We did have the capabilities then that we do now, but that was a memory that I never will forget with the early days of the JTF C&D. And I think at that point, DISA had given General Campbell a card table and a chair in the corner of the NOSC, and 24 people who were sitting out in the van down by the river that he talked with. And those were the early days. But ladies and gentlemen, General Soup Campbell.
Well, I just realized there's a danger in being introduced by somebody who knows you so well. Yeah. What could have been 3 minutes turned into 10, but thank you, Harry. So, yeah, I got into, and by the way, I realized something yesterday. We talk about transitions and tipping points. We've hit a tipping point where General Raduege no longer means Harry Raduege. It means Chad Raduege. So congratulations, you did well. So I got into the cyber business late. As Harry said, I was on the Joint Staff in '97, and we had an exercise called Eligible Receiver 97. You may have seen that in the history books. But anyway, it exposed a huge hole in our ability to assess, detect, assess, and attribute the cyber attack, and then to do anything about it. And one of the big lessons was there's nobody in charge. So with the top cover of Dr. John Hamre, who was a DepSecDef, and Denny Blair, who was the director of the Joint Staff, and Vern Clark, who was a J3, I was the J39, and we kind of got handed the action because we were the only group of folks in the Joint Staff that had the clearances to work all aspects of the problem. So one of the recommendations we came up with was to stand up an organization that would have, directive control over actions in case of a cyber attack. And we struggled with how to do that, and as you might imagine, there was a huge pushback from the services who didn't want some joint organization looking at their networks, but we got agreement. A joint task force was the model that we used, and we stood that up. And I was the first commander. I think I was because I was due for an assignment, and at least could spell JTF that I got that assignment. It turned out to be really a turning point in my career, and it was really interesting because, as Harry said, that morphed through a number of organizational changes. And Harry was the commander of one of those organizations, and you can trace the lineage right to U.S. Cyber Command today. So I think the model we had was a good one, and it was right. It just took time to mature. But one of the issues was, as Harry said, what's the chain of command? Who does what to who? How do we organize this big monster? But anyway, I think I was pretty happy with the way that turned out. Harry asked me if I would say a few words about the cybersecurity moonshot. I thought perhaps it might be mentioned someplace in the proceedings this week. I guess it hasn't, so I'll give you the 50,000-foot overview. I serve as the NSTAC point of contact for Iridium Communications. My CEO is a member of the NSTAC. You may know the NSTAC is made up of 30 CEO-level individuals from the telecom industry, set up to advise the president on the national security and emergency preparedness issues. We do a report roughly once a year on an item either directed by the White House or suggested by the membership. And the 2019 project was on the idea of a cybersecurity moonshot. So why did we select that, and how, what does it mean? Well, the symbology is pretty obvious. The original moonshot sort of, galvanized national action toward a goal that we thought was extremely important. Got really the whole of government, at least, behind that job, and we did it. And so that was the analogy that the membership used. There have been a lot of analogies over time in the cyber business to real-world events. We talked about the cyber Pearl Harbor and the cyber 9/11. Fortunately, we haven't had those. We haven't really had the cyber equivalent of the Sputnik moment that generated the original moonshot. But there's a belief and a view that that's potentially not very far around the corner. And the NSTAC view was that we ought to do something about it proactively. Suzanne used the word existential. In a different sense, that's the kind of the view of the NSTAC leadership, is that we are faced with a potential existential crisis, and the choice being the tipping point between having a smoothly functioning digital society, and which underpins everything we do, and evolving into chaos where not only things don't work, but you can't even trust the things that do work. Sue's comments were perfect setup for the discussion of a cybersecurity moonshot, because really, in the end, it's a matter of national priorities. What do we believe, and where do we put our efforts? And by the way, the cybersecurity moonshot report is on the DHS website. It's all public, and so I'd encourage you to go there and scan it, because it's pretty good reading. But the NSTAC view, again, the 30 CEO-level individuals, was that the severity and the complexity of the cybersecurity threat does represent an existential threat to the smooth functioning of our society, that there's a narrowing fine line between that society and, as I said, the chaos that might result, and we ought to do something about it. There is an obvious that a successful moonshot is going to require strong national leadership, political will, and adequate resourcing to have a sustained whole-of-nation effort that'll be required to pull that off. And Ms. Payton's comments about the cybersecurity budget really ring true here, because part of the measure of how strongly we feel about this will be the resources we put against it. So the goal of the project, as articulated by the NSTAC, was to make the internet safe and secure for the functioning of government and critical services for the American people by 2028. Now, your first reaction is, well, that's not a very objective measure. What does safe and secure mean? And that's part of the reason that was chosen, is that it's difficult to put objective measures on what safe and secure will mean by 2028. But you can come up with some descriptions of what that might look like, and you probably can, in your own mind, have some, and actually DHS has talked about some measures. So that's something we think will come out of whatever effort follows, is a description of what a safe and secure digital environment will look like. The other part of that definition was the time frame. 2028 was selected because we used that 10-year period the feeling was that if there's a shorter period, we're going to default to some sort of a technical solution that we'll put in place and that'll solve the problem. And really, we think it's the solution is going to be across a whole range of things, and I'll talk about those in just a second here. Some broad recommendations. It's got to be led by the U.S. government, but it's not a U.S. government project. It's a whole nation project. It's got to be sponsored by the president or the vice president at that level. It's got to have that continuing emphasis. There's probably a cybersecurity moonshot council chaired by the vice president. It's focused on long-term goals, that 10-year goal. It doesn't foreclose any of the things that we do day to day to address the problems we have, but it looks at the holistic solution over a 10-year period. Probably most importantly, the report, when you read it, there really are no specific recommendations for what ought to happen. The report kind of sets the framework and the broad perspective for how we would address the problem. It does recommend, after consideration, we think there are 6 pillars that might underpin the effort. I'll just briefly describe each of those, and if you want to follow up on it later, we can do that. The first pillar is technology, and I have to tell you that in discussions, it was tempting to jump right to write some technology solution like a segmented internet or something like that. We backed away from that because we didn't want to prescribe in a 6-month effort what is a 10-year problem. So we think there's a strong technology component to it, but again, the framework of the report just sets up the discussion of that. The second pillar is human behavior. Now, that's kind of hard to quantify, but basically it's discussion of how do we interface with the internet? How do we act in a digital society? How are people convinced that this is something that they ought to be worried about and ought to be a national effort? The third pillar is education. I personally think this is a huge one. There's an enormous shortage of workers in the cybersecurity business, which has sort of always puzzled me because it's pretty highly paid. The average cyber worker earns a salary 3 times the national median income. So why is it that you would think the normal supply and demand of the market would fill that need? But yet we see that need continuing and probably growing out through the out years. So what is it about the educational enterprise that doesn't produce the kinds of workers and the volume and the quality that we need? The fourth pillar is the ecosystem, American society, and the observation was that this, as a whole of nation effort, will require interaction of government, of industry, of society. General Shea this morning asked General Kennedy, he said, the Air Force has got a great model, how do you sell that to the other services? Well, this is maybe a bigger perspective on that same question. How do you sell this across the various parts of our nation, and not just the government, but the industry and the people? The fifth pillar is privacy. This is an interesting one to me. The concept I have of privacy is not the same as my granddaughter has of privacy. That's why I don't do Facebook, and she loves it. So I think part of that will be deciding what degree of privacy do we expect, and do we understand what's out there. But the American people ought to have under this construct ought to have an expectation and understanding of what privacy is. And the final pillar is policy. There obviously has to be a framework of policy to underpin the effort and underpin the direction we go. I'll close with that with one last observation, and I love this one. Peter Altebeff, who's the CEO of Unisys, has said, at least in the original moonshot, although we didn't know how we were going to get there or when it would happen, we were pretty sure that when we were ready to launch, we would know where the moon is, and we would know what the conditions for success were. We have no idea what the target's going to be in 2028, and it's really going to be hard to judge what success is. So that's going to be a part of the national discussion about what the moonshot means and what we do to get there. So I'll close with that. Again, the report's on the DHS website, and it's pretty cool reading.
Thank you very much, General Campbell, and thanks for that kind of quick recap of the cybersecurity moonshot report. You know, very quickly, you know, Sue Payton held up a copy of the National Cybersecurity Strategy, very important document. Lots of smart people put a lot of thought into that. And General Campbell's just also explained what 30 of our nation's smartest CEOs and their representatives have done in writing a cybersecurity moonshot concept and along with a number of recommendations in those 6 pillars. But let me just have a show of hands. I'm going to ask the audience a question. How many have seen or recognized or have any implementation going on of the cybersecurity moonshot? Okay, it's pretty limited. General Wegeman's got it. He's reading it, so and probably taking actions on it at Air Combat Command and beyond. So that's good news. Let me start by asking, with our limited time that we have, although it's adequate, are there any questions from the microphones out there? Any brave individual who wants to pose a question to the panel members? Not right now. Oh,
One up front?
there is. Oh my goodness. I don't even know if he needs a microphone, but let's please. Wait, John, hold it. There are people listening elsewhere that want to hear.
Okay.
They want to hear you.
I appreciate that.
Yes, sir.
The question really is to Miss Payton, who during my time on active duty, she was kind of like a God czarist in the acquisition world, okay?
Not worthy.
Seriously. But
Yeah, that's true.
how do we go ahead, and you mentioned the funding, the architectural stuff, the moonshot, the strategy. How do we convince the people that control all of that, that it's just as important to have the cyber slice of our network of warfighting out there than it is the $6.4 billion to buy F-35? How do we convince them? How does that happen?
Well, you have to have the American people demanding it. When Sputnik went up in 1957, my husband was 10 years old. They ripped his little buns away from cartoons on Saturday morning and put him in STEM, math classes. The education department got behind this. It's an all hands on deck, all of government moment. And I have so much hope with U.S. Cyber Command that they will be given more authority, more funding, requirements, and have the business model all in one place. Because the more we distribute the funding all over the federal government, the less traction we get. I'm so encouraged by the U.S. Space Command stand-up and the U.S. Space Force, because one guy right now, and the model should probably be that one guy heads both of them. If you look at the NRO model, you've got requirements, you've got funding, and you've got your acquisition bubbas all together to get the mission done. The metric may not be all about money, right? It may not be a huge amount of money as it has been for hardware on the ramp. But I will tell you that until we get an all-of-government approach, and I got to tell you, it does start at the Vice President's office, because that's where everyone finally comes together in our federal government. That's pretty high level. And what he's done with the National Space Council, I think is making good progress. And I think there are ways we can use money more effectively. I am optimistic because we have other transactions agreements that we can use. to bring industry and academia together. And we can build trust, because guess what? You can ask a contracting officer a question about anything even after you've submitted your white paper. So it's going to have to come, I hate to say it, from the president down, because money is just, it's the battle in the building. It's the battle in the federal government to maintain your budget at all costs. I appreciate the question. It's a gnarly problem, and it can only be solved by the big guy.
Okay, I've gotten a number of questions in one central area here. Let me just put to our panel two of the questions as written, because they are related. A lot of speakers have spoken about the military's classification system as a barrier to cybersecurity. So what can be done? And the related question is, how would you educate the general user workforce on cybersecurity in the future to help ensure the security of networks given the ever-changing cyber threats? Zan?
So it has come to my attention now that I sit on both sides that intelligence in the government is exactly the same thing as information in the private sector. And you would be shocked and alarmed to find out that most of what we highly classify, particularly in this environment, can be found in the dark web and in completely unclassified open source areas and leveraged in exactly the same way. So the government says that if the intelligence community goes into foreign space and finds it, it's by definition classified. But that foreign space in the network, all the rest of what we're seeing, not just what you're seeing on your web and your URL, but everything that is deeply embedded in the network is completely discoverable. And as a matter of fact, that discovery can inform you and allow action every bit as much, and it's often exactly the same information that is classified. So I'm always stunned when we pretend they're two different things. They're not. And so I'll just leave that with you. It's kind of a ridiculous behavior when in fact we know that's the case.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, Sue?
Yeah, that's a great question. When I was the J39, one of the part of the job was maintaining oversight of the SAPs, the black programs. We got to review those semi-annually. But part of my job was to go out to the combatant commands and brief the commanders on the programs that had been allocated to them under the Integrated Joint Technical Special Ops system. I'm not sure if that system still exists, but it was a way to provide access to the programs that would be of use to specific combatant commanders, and not all commanders had access to every one. But it was part of the problem. Number one, there was an enormous amount of frustration on the part of combatant commanders who always believed there was stuff that was not being disclosed to them they could use. And partly that there was, in part because the services kept stuff out of the IGISTO system and didn't get it out to them. But that aside, the other problem was that typically you'd have the commander and some major down in the joint in their the J3 shop who would be the only people in the command who had access because of the level of classification of the program. So in terms of being able to, write it into war plans, exercise it, figure out how it supported your the kinetic plans, it was really a dysfunctional system. So I hope that's gotten better. I did notice General Hyten the other day commented that he thought things were way overclassified.
Ridiculous.
And I support an effort he can lead. He's got a pretty bully pulpit to do it from, an effort to reduce the level of classification, because all these great programs are no good unless they're in the hands of the people who can use them.
Yeah, I was going to build upon what both my colleagues said, and look at present day in the conversation we're having around the globe around a Chinese telecommunications firm, and our allies are looking at the case and saying, no, I'm going to go over here, right? UK most recently, and I think it points to exactly what we're talking about is we are overclassifying. And if the point is we need to protect intelligence assets, then let's do that, but still get to a point where we can explain what's going on. And it is it's one of the hurdles that we're putting in front of ourselves that I don't think needs to be there. And I'll just add that in industry, I have an SCI today, but the conversations I've had since I left the government are almost non-existent, and shame on us if that's the case, right? But I shouldn't have to have that clearance necessarily. Anyhow, back to the first point, right? We should get this to a point where we can clearly explain in plain English what's going on.
Well, and there's one more thing. There's a little bit of culpability for Congress here. When you're in the building and you want to get something done quickly, and you want to be able to have some autonomy, you want to deal with 8 people on the Hill who know what you're doing, right? And that's what a SAP is all about. A special access program eliminates an immense amount of paperwork, reporting, briefing OSD, going to the Hill, having hearings. And so we've tried to use special access programs as a way to get things done more efficiently and more effective. The problem is we have so many of these that are not able to be integrated now because very few people have the knowledge of all of them. And so I think to some degree we need to get Congress to understand that micromanaging every last thing that a program is doing is actually hurting our progress.
Harry, you had a 2-part question. So
Yes.
on the part about training and everything else, even this morning when General Kennedy talked about standards and evaluation, it's training, stand, eval is the way that the structure that we've done it, which like Sue mentioned earlier, we chop things up.
Right.
Just a note, in cyber, the gamification of the training and the evaluation, there are actually companies that build the capability, and the Army is using them in their cyber defense teams, that uses an on-net game where people play against each other in a war game. And it trains the capability, and the system can actually evaluate how somebody's doing, whether they have the proclivity to be able to do it, and which parts are they actually using and are capable of versus which they still have to be trained, and evaluates how good they are against each other, and it allows them to ingest what is brand new immediately into the game so that everyone's playing it at the same time. So we need to think differently and actually use the capability that we're talking about in order to train and evaluate those that are then going to do that as their primary mission. And so if we're thinking the old way, it's not going to work in this environment.
Great point, great point. Is there another question from the microphone? General Shea has got his hand up. Say, Bob, just a minute. General Campbell had mentioned the name of General Hyten, a great friend of this community here. But in fact, I had a meeting in the Pentagon last Friday, and I was taking several people in. One of them happened to be a Canadian national, had various security clearances and everything, but I'll tell you, I had to work for 2 months to get that person in. And then we end up at the door on Friday morning, and he's going through the slug line area in there, and he's detained for quite some time until we could get things going. And I found it interesting that it was that morning that the article appeared in the news about General Hyten was tired of this overclassification. And as a matter of fact, he was in print about it, and he says, I have the concurrence from the chairman, and I have the concurrence from an agreement from the Secretary of Defense that we need to do something about this. And General Hyten's point was, I meet regularly with certain people that come in here, but he says if I meet with one, I ought to be able to meet with them all. And so I think we're going to see more coming from that, from a great leader who spent a lot of time with us out here in Colorado Springs and is now number 2 in the Pentagon and the military forces. General Shea.
Yeah, I keep hearing this term trust. It keeps coming up over and over again. I look at China. In many cases, they're demanding exposure to our technology. We are many of our companies are global companies now, and they're impacted by the influence of outside sources, not just the United States. I look what's going on in Europe with Huawei and 5G, and I can just imagine a scenario where a lot of information is collected, that information is fed back to China or some other country, you pick it out, and they get ahead of us in terms of discussions, negotiations, the economic impact that's going on. So I'd like to know, is there a new paradigm of trust that I'm missing?
There is the old Ronnie Reagan saying, trust but verify. I was out at the Reagan National Defense Forum, peace through strength, you know, this is it, deter. We're not going to sit back. We're going to counter if we're attacked, and maybe not even in the cyber realm. But trust, it starts at a very low level to start with, and once you lose it, it's lost forever. And I believe that one of the things across acquisition we need to do is have more cross-fertilization. I had 17 years in industry before I went in government. I trusted industry because I had been there. I understood industry and their incentives. Then I got to go back to industry. But I got to tell you that protests and the fact that the lawyers and the contracting officers many times do not understand the threats are causing problems with opening us up this whole area of trust between industry and the government, and I believe especially in the Pentagon. Relative to trust across the globe, I offer that question to our other panelists, but we have got to get back in this country to trusting each other again.
Yeah, I'd build on, Suzanne, what you said. I think, right, our adversaries don't have the characteristics or the philosophy around openness and transparency and privacy, and we can never lose that. So we've got to turn around and turn that to our benefit, right? Our creativity, our diversity, our innovation will always outpace that closed mindset. And I think that's what, right now there's a bit of a, I don't want to call it a struggle, it's probably not the right term, but we've got to have a clear focus on where we're trying to go. So I come back to the moonshot. You know, I think that the bone is there's no meat around it. I mean, it could be put there, and you made a good point, John, that is, you know, by 2028, what are we going to achieve? But I think if we take a couple of those things and build upon them, you know, double down on industry and government academia participation and some clear innovation cycles, the education from when you're in kindergarten all the way up, because privacy is different for every generation. I think that's where the trust is going to come from, is right now I think we're going at it in fragments, and that's why I took you guys down memory lane with me. We know how to do the things that we need to do, but we're very fragmented right now, right? It's the people, the processes, the technology, and how we bring that whole of nation focus to execute. I strongly believe our model is the best, but I think we're doing it in pockets, and it's not clearly towards the goals that we need to set out for ourselves. And I know this conversation is not solving it, but I think it's incumbent upon us to take it to the next level.
Other comments? Okay, we've got time for one last question, and actually this one was addressed straight to Chris. From a virtualization perspective, please discuss complete migration of data centers to the cloud and security ramifications associated with that migration and ingrained reticence to make that migration.
First, I would say virtualization doesn't have to occur in the cloud. The cloud is that common place that everybody is going, right? Because we've had this drop in the price, the increase on the security, the ability to compute in ways we've never done before. Storage has been virtualized. Now the network is being virtualized through software-defined networking. So virtualization can occur on your premise, right? Or in your data center. You should be building cloud stacks, private clouds. If you want to take it to a cloud provider, they are certainly not inherently less secure. They are just as secure, if not more secure, than because of the fragmentation I just spoke about. So virtualization, the point that I was making is that we've got to get into a software-based set of capabilities, not a hardware racking and stacking 5, 6, 7, and the next 10 things that come down the pike. Software, right, I think it was Anderson that said, you know, software is eating the world. Well, every company is a digital company, every organization, their mission is relying on it. So we've got to take software and when done right, right? The ability to be more resilient, to do that more quickly, more cost optimally, more with better performance is what I was driving at. Now here's the point. While we're kind of targeting the big monolithic clouds that are out there, there's this back to the future moment we're having with 5G, and that is the edge compute is probably going to surpass the large cloud compute at some point in time. You're going to have both and things in between. But the point is that virtualizing our capabilities so we can move more quickly than our adversary. And last thing I'll say, because I know we were talking before we came on stage, is resilience. Ultimately, if you can move your workloads around the globe to where you need them and start over. I mean, we're still today going down to bare metal when we have major compromises. The ability to actually move workloads securely and start over from a known good set of controls and applications is extraordinary. So that's why virtualization, I know your question was how do you move it all? That's always an effort that's going to be ongoing. It depends where you are in the spectrum of maturity and where your apps are. I was kind of laying out the component pieces. You know, having a clear architecture and a clear set of goals to drive that is probably first thing in your plan.
Great. Ladies and gentlemen, we're out of time for this wonderful panel. We weren't able to get to all of the written questions that came in, but please join me in thanking them for their time, and especially somebody that got up here with 12 hours notice and still did a magnificent job.
Get a home run.
General Raduege, on behalf of the chapter, I want to thank you and your panelists year after year. It's always a great discussion, and you always bring it, so we appreciate your time today. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you, Rich.
Chad.
Could you take a...
Not me. Okay, at this point, again, if you are tracking your continuing education credits, I encourage you not to miss the today's Tech Talks, which are starting at 11:15 over in the Colorado Hall, just to the east of us, out the front door, follow the signs to the left. Today we have GitLab and Google will be your hosts for the Tech Talks, and then after that, please join us if you registered at 12:30 for our keynote luncheon over in the International Hall, sponsored by AT&T. Lieutenant General Jay Severia from the Academy will be the speaker, and then we will see you back here after that. Thank you very much.